Opposition spokesperson Andrew Rosindell.
Thank you, Mrs Yorbuck, and thank you to my honourable friend, the Member for Farnham and Borden, for raising this very important issue today on the floor of the House. It is an important debate that we must have, and UK-China relations is going to be increasingly important as we progress and as the threat of China becomes more evident. So I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions today. It seems like there is a consensus about the threat that China poses, perhaps not entirely unanimous. The member for Folkestone Hythe seems to have a slightly different approach. But I do believe that China poses one of the greatest, if not the greatest, threats to our freedom and security, and that's why it's vital that we address this issue today. However, China is a nation with proud history and a rich civilization, deserving respect. But, Madam Chairman, that respect can come only at the expense, cannot come at the expense of turning a blind eye to aggression, human rights abuses and attempts to undermine the international order. The government have announced that they are conducting a China audit, but we have yet to hear what that actually entails. It is not enough for ministers to simply review our policy towards China behind closed doors. The British people deserve transparency and Parliament deserves answers. So let me begin. If you don't mind, I'm going to make some progress, and then if there's time, I'll come to you. Let me begin with the issue of Taiwan, the Republic of China. Beijing's increasingly assertive behaviour towards Taiwan, including military activity around the island, airspace incursions and naval operations, is a growing cause of concern. And I ask the government, will the Minister tell us, does the UK remain committed to the One China policy? And if so, how does the government intend to balance that position with our strong interest in supporting Taiwan's democracy and the principle that the future of Taiwan should be determined peacefully and without coercion? I believe that the people of Taiwan should have the freedom to shape their own future without the threat of force. So, what steps is the government taking alongside the United States, Japan and Australia to reduce tensions and deter any escalation in the Taiwan Straits? Taiwan is a proud democracy and they deserve to have their freedom and they should not be coerced, and we as an ally of Taiwan should certainly be there standing shoulder to shoulder with them. So next I'd like to say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now this is a programme that Beijing claims is about infrastructure and development, but which in reality serves as a tool for strategic dominance and debt entrapment. Across Africa, Asia and even parts of Europe, we have seen the consequences of this so-called investment. Developing nations are finding themselves shackled by unsustainable debt, forced to hand over key infrastructure and strategic assets when they cannot meet Beijing's demands. When is the government's strategy? What is the government's strategy to counter this growing influence? How are we supporting our Commonwealth partners and other vulnerable nations in resisting this economic model? And will the Minister tell us what alternative are we offering to the developing world to avoid them being trapped into Beijing's orbit? On Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party's flagrant violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration is seriously jeopardising the One Nation, Two Systems framework. Beijing has crushed political opposition, tried to silence free press and criminalised dissent. In light of this, I ask the Minister, what is our long-term strategy for holding Beijing accountable for breaking its treaty obligations? How are we supporting British nationals overseas who have made the courageous decision to leave Hong Kong and settle in the United Kingdom, and who may be at risk of transitional repression? The case of Jimmy Lai stands as a stark symbol of Beijing's assault on press freedom and political dissent in Hong Kong. Lai, a British citizen and a founder of Apple Daily, has been targeted under Hong Kong's draconian national security law for the so-called crime of defending democracy. His prosecution is not just an attack on an individual, it is an attempt to silence independent journalism, intimidate anyone who dares to criticise the CCP's actions in Hong Kong. And I must ask the government, what steps are they taking to protect the rights of British citizens like Jimmy Lai, who are facing politically motivated prosecutions in Hong Kong? So, does the Minister agree that this politically motivated trial must end and that Jimmy Lai must be released? And what is the government's strategy for making the case that the national security law should be replaced? The CCP's human rights abuses in Xinjiang are well documented. Forced labour, mass internment and systematic persecution of the Uyghur population. It is therefore deeply concerning that the government appears to be resisting efforts to block the procurement of Chinese solar panels linked to forced labour under the GB Energy Bill. And I ask the government directly, what assurances can ministers provide that the UK's transition to net zero will not come at the cost of complicity in modern slavery? How will the government ensure that supply chains for renewable energy infrastructure are free from forced labour and other human rights abuses? As the leader of the opposition rightly pointed out in her recent speech, the idea of achieving net zero by 2050 while relying heavily on Chinese technology and supply chains is fantasy politics. We cannot afford an over-reliance on China, as should have been made clear following the pandemic. What steps is the government taking to reduce strategic dependence on China, particularly in the critical industries like energy, telecommunications and rare earth minerals? The proposed Chinese super embassy in London raises concerns about Beijing's growing influence in the UK. The unprecedented size and scope of this facility has prompted worries about potential security risks and pressure on Chinese dissidents. Reports of covert Chinese police stations in the UK add to these fears. Has the government assessed the national security risks, and will they consider restricting or scaling down this proposal? More broadly, what steps are the government taking to prevent foreign powers from using British soil for covert operations or political intimidation? And I want to make the case again, as my party has said before, that China should be on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. And finally, I must also raise the Chancellor of the Exchequer's recent visit to China. What, if any, assurances did the Chancellor seek on human rights during her visit to Hong Kong, the Uyghurs or Taiwan? And how does the government intend to ensure that any future economic engagement with China does not compromise our strategic interests? In closing, Mrs. Liu-Bach, China presents one of the big geopolitical challenges of our age, not just to Britain, but to the entire free world. We cannot afford to be naive. Engagement must be grounded in realism, not wishful thinking. We must work with our allies to check aggression and defend our democratic values. The British people deserve to know where their government stands, and the government must be prepared to act and not just talk. Yeah.